In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint a mountain landscape using gouache paint, and I'm going to give you some tips on colours and values, painting landscapes and using gouache paint in general. So without further ado, we'll get straight into the video and I hope you enjoy it. The painting I'm about to demonstrate is inspired by the Queenstown area in southern New Zealand, and these are a couple of the reference photos that I used. So this area is surrounded by high mountains and there's loads of subjects to paint here, especially if you're a landscape artist. It's a really inspiring place. So I'm painting on watercolour paper and it roughly measures around 12 centimetres by 16 centimetres. And what I've done is I've kind of taped the area that I'm painting just using masking tape, and I've just sketched in with a pencil the composition. Now what I've been doing with gouache painting is I've kind of been treating it a little bit like the way I paint my oil paintings, in that I start with painting the shadows and the dark values in the scene first, and that's what I'm doing here. So I'm starting with the mountain shadows and I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, permanent white and a little alizarin crimson. Now speaking of colours, I'll just go over the colours that I'm using. I'm using Winsor & Newton designer gouache paints. They're really nice to use, and the colours I'm using includes permanent white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and viridian. So I'm trying to use the same or similar colours as to what I'd use for when I'm painting landscapes in oils. So now, as I say, I'm painting my dark values and shadows first. And the reason for doing this is so that I can build up a tonal dynamic in the scene that I'm painting. It means that when I come to paint the areas in light, that it's going to be much easier to get the saturation of the colour correct. And it means that my mountains are going to recede into the distance as I want them to. And the reason for this is that we will find our darkest values and shadows in the foreground of a painting, and this is because we'll find our darkest darks here. We'll also find our lightest lights in the foreground of a landscape, but as landforms recede, darks are not as dark and lights are not as light, and that's because the value scale narrows. So if we have a quick look at the value scale here, we have white at one end and black at the other, and then in the middle there's a load of greys and mid-tones. So we'll be using the full value scale in the foreground of a painting, because as I say, we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights there, but then as the landforms recede, that value scale gets narrower and we'll have a more kind of light to mid-tones. So this is something to keep in mind if you want to paint things that look like they're in the distance, such as hills and mountains, and this is actually very important in a landscape painting if you want to make it look realistic and you want it to read well to the viewer. And of course, value is how light or dark your subject is. So right now I've painted my dark values, at least the main areas of dark values in the painting. So we've got the lower part of the mountain, then the upper part that's got some snow on it that's reflecting in the light even though it's in shadow. And then we've got the tree shadows, and trees are some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape. So for this I've used a mix of ultramarine blue and a little yellow ochre, and that just helps to give it a green cast, but it's generally a low chroma colour. Chroma is another word for saturation, so it's just like the intensity of the colour. Now the next thing I'm doing here is I'm starting to add my lights in. So going back to the mountain here, painting the areas in the lower part of the mountain where there's no snow on it, that's in the full sunlight, and it's a kind of a pale colour, especially in winter. It's a low chroma colour. There's lots of tussock grass growing on the mountain, and that's a kind of straw coloured low chroma colour anyway. The brushes I'm using are mostly synthetic flat brushes at this stage. They're made by Rosemary & Co. And if you want to get some Rosemary & Co brushes, I've put a link in the description box below. I'd absolutely recommend them. I've been using them for years for oil painting and now for gouache painting. Now back to the foreground here, and I'm marking in the area of the frost covered grass that's in shadow. So this is a kind of a pale greenish blue, but the value is darker than if the grass was in the full sunlight, and grass along with the sky, is also some of the lightest values to be found in the landscape. This is also a mix of ultramarine blue with yellow ochre and some permanent white. Now moving on to the sky, as I said, just like the grass, it's one of the lightest values to be found in the landscape. And for the sky here, I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with permanent white and a little bit of viridian. Now, one thing I've noticed with gouache painting, and I'm still trying to get my handle on this, is that the colours, some of them have a tendency to dry darker than when you initially laid them down. So it's something to keep in mind when you're painting with gouache, but really it's not a problem anyway, because even if it is tonally darker, it's easier to add lighter values afterwards. And in fact, actually, when I'm working through my paintings, whether it's a gouache painting or an oil painting, I tend to keep it tonally darker anyway, so that I've still got plenty of room to add my light values. And then I'll be saving my lightest values, so my lightest lights, until the very end of the painting, and this will make it kind of pop and come alive. Now here with the sky, what I did was I added some lighter values to near where the summit of the mountain is. Obviously because the sky is lighter as it recedes more into the distance and goes nearer the horizon line, so I was adding a bit more permanent white into the mix there. And then moving forward, painting this stand of willow trees. Now these willow trees are in winter, so there's no leaves on them, but the twigs are kind of this sort of creamy yellowish crimson colour as well, and they can look orange. Another thing I've found when painting winter deciduous trees is they're nowhere near as dark in value as they would be when they're got all their leaves on them. So this is something to think about when you're painting these in the landscape, because if they're positioned wrongly in the landscape or the surrounding colours are of a similar value, they can actually get lost in the landscape. So it's something to think about, and this was something I learnt through painting outdoors on plein air, when I suddenly realised that what I was seeing in nature wasn't translating well on a canvas. So as I say, this is something to think about when painting winter trees, but they really do look good in winter landscapes such as this. So I've just marked in that tree canopy for the willow trees there. It was mainly a mix of yellow ochre with alizarin crimson and some permanent white, and even a little bit of ultramarine blue to desaturate. And then moving on to the grass here, that's a mix of yellow ochre, ultramarine blue with cadmium yellow as my base, and then I've lightened the value with permanent white. I've mixed in a bit of viridian and even a bit of cadmium red, and I've just varied the mixtures according to the zones that I'm painting. So the main area of grass has a lot of straw coloured grass on there, so it's got a lot more permanent white and yellow ochre in the mix, whereas the hill just behind it's got a bit more ultramarine blue and viridian in the mix, as well as cadmium yellow. I've used the same colours for the trees as well. There's just much less titanium white in there, and the dominant colours are ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow. And then I moved on to the snow in the mountain, so it's permanent white with a little bit of that shadow mixed in it to keep it a bit tonally darker, so that when I add those highlights right at the end, that's really going to make it look much more realistic. Now what I do at this stage in gouache painting is I try and get all the base colours down, and the painting can look a bit ratty at this stage. I've also used a much thinner wash of the colours as well, so I've just got a good base there, and then I'll come in with the thicker paint. So this is what I'm doing now. I'm starting to model the mountain here and add more details to it. I'm applying the paint here with this evergreen angular brush, which is really good for painting the suggestion of jagged rocks and snow, exposed rock faces on the sides of the mountain, also these shadows here. And I'm using the same colours that I was using just a moment ago. Now the cool thing about these little studies is you can paint them in no time at all. I think this painting took me about a couple of hours, and what I've been doing actually is I've been using these as little preliminary colour studies for larger paintings. So I'm actually just planning a load of larger paintings at the moment. I've got a watercolour pad with about 50 sheets in it, and I'm just planning loads of landscape paintings in them. What I did before I started this painting was I did a couple of little thumbnail sketches just to roughly plan out the composition, not spending too much time. And what I'll do then is, if I'm happy with this particular painting, is then I'll take the idea further. So I'll do a proper final pencil sketch, maybe just make some adjustments to the composition and then I'll do a little colour study in oils and then take it to a bigger painting. But for now, I just want to see if they're even going to work. So I've found that not only you can get some great effects with gouache painting, but they're a good way of just quickly getting some ideas down on some paper, get an idea what the colours are going to look like, and see if you want to take the idea further. And they just make nice little paintings also. Now, I've not been using gouache for all that long, probably about just over a year, but just increasingly I'm using it more and more. I'm just really liking this medium and just how quickly you can get some really quite beautiful results. Some of the gouache paintings that I've been seeing from other artists on Instagram, I can't even tell if they're actual oil paintings or gouache paintings. So as I say, you can get some really great effects with them. Now here I'm working on the foreground. I'm adding some more layers to the grass. It's the same colours that I used just a moment ago, ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre and titanium white. But I've made the value a little bit lighter, and I'm using these vertical upwards and downwards brush motions here just to paint the suggestion of grass, so painting it in the direction that the grass is growing. Now another advantage of gouache paint is it dries quickly. But unlike acrylics, you can re-wet the paint, so you can still blend in colours. And even if you've made mistakes, you can actually just add thicker layers and paint over them. So I find gouache to be quite versatile. And I think you could go quite detailed as well if you wanted to. Now here I'm working on the willow tree, so just building up some layers on there. And I'm using the same colours that I was using just earlier. So this was yellow ochre with some alizarin crimson and permanent white are the main colours. If you want to desaturate the colour, you can mix in some ultramarine blue, and the reason being is because with alizarin crimson and yellow ochre together, it kind of makes an orangey colour, and orange is opposite to blue on the colour wheel, so when they're combined they desaturate each other and cancel each other out. So that's a way of taking the intensity out the colour, but this is going to look nice in the landscape. So at the moment I've just added some darker values, and I was letting that dry as I was then painting the grass here, which is just some lighter layers that I added using the same colours that I used a moment ago. It's just got more titanium white in the mix. But then I'll go back to the willow trees and add some more lighter values to the upper section of the canopies. This is the cool thing about gouache, is I can work on one section of it, and then just whilst it's waiting to dry I can work on another area of the painting. Now another thing to keep in mind when you're painting a landscape, or indeed any type of painting, is to keep in mind the colour harmony, and this is where the colours are working with each other harmoniously and the painting looks nice and it reads well to the viewer. So basically you can look at the painting and think, wow, those colours are really nice and it just looks like a nice painting, and you might not even know why. Well, it's generally the colour harmony, and the way you can achieve colour harmony in your painting is to try and use similar colours throughout the painting. So I try and keep my colour mixes as simple as I can. It's not always possible, but if I can get away with just using 2 or 3 colours, I will. But I try and use similar colours throughout the painting. So for example, here in the mountains I've used ultramarine blue and burnt sienna and titanium white and alizarin crimson. And I've also used that in other areas of the painting, like I've used that in the willow tree canopies. For the grass, especially in the foreground, I've been using ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. I've been using ultramarine blue and yellow ochre in the trees and in the fields. And even in the lower parts of the trees, and for some of these darker areas, I've been using a bit of yellow ochre in the mix. There's also some burnt sienna in there. And I found that using a more limited palette helps to create colour harmony in the painting, because you're using less colours. You're more likely to be using all of those colours on your palette. So for me, it helps simplify things, and it also helps to give you a better understanding of colours and values. Now here I'm painting the suggestion of stems and branches in the willow trees, and I'm using a Shiraz rigger brush to apply the paint. This is a number 2 Shiraz rigger brush. A nice, really useful brush to use in gouache painting, especially for painting main stems and branches. I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna, a little permanent white and a little alizarin crimson. Now going back to the canopies of the willow trees, and I'm just painting some darker value colour just in the mid and lower section of the tree canopies, and then coming in with some lighter values on top. So I'm still using the same colours, I'm just adjusting the values with permanent white. Now when you add permanent white into your mix, that's also going to desaturate the colour, so you will likely have to readjust some of the colours once you've added it. So here I've had to add in a little bit more yellow ochre. But we're certainly getting to the end stages of this painting and I'm starting to think about wrapping up. So just filling in the last of these gaps where the paper underneath is being exposed. And just adding some more details to these trees in the midground here. They're mostly conifer trees. There's also a couple of gum trees, but really they could be anything. But they're certainly helping with the composition. I'm still using my 1/4 inch evergreen angular brush here. It's just really good for painting tree canopies. And using similar colours that I used to start with. So mainly a mix of yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and cadmium yellow as my base. Then I've lightened the value with some permanent white, and there's also a little bit of cadmium red in there as well. So red is opposite to green on the colour wheel, and I like to have some kind of red element in my greens just because I've found that it helps to make it look a bit more natural, and it can take some of the vibrancy out of the green so that you're not getting these kind of artificial or neon looking greens that look a bit weird in your paintings. Greens are one of those colours that people have the most difficulty with, because if you get them wrong they can really upset your entire landscape painting. Now if I want to shift the hue of my green and just add some more emerald tones in there, I can mix in a little bit of viridian, and that makes the green look really quite nice, and we can get some really nice natural looking greens that you'd find in trees and grass. But in general, this whole scene, it's a winter scene, there's frost on the ground, so a lot of these colours are pale and low in chroma. Now the next thing I'm doing with these trees is I'm marking in some shadows on the grass, so that's going to help with the overall three-dimensional effect of the painting, and I'm just sort of building up these last details in the foreground and midground before I work on the background mountain, which is what I saved until last. Mainly because of the snow, which is the lightest value colour in this whole scene, and I've saved this until the very end of the painting. Now if you'd like to learn more about painting landscapes in gouache paint or in oils, then you've got to check out my Patreon channel. I've got loads of full-length painting tutorial videos there, and I upload a new full tutorial every month, plus there's reference photos, lesson notes, and then other bonus videos on there. So if you want to improve your painting skills, or even if you're a complete beginner, or you just want to be inspired by my painting style, then you've got to check out my Patreon channel. It's just $5 a month, and I've put the link in the description box below. So painting these last details on the mountain, and even here in the midground just on the grass, so I've just added some more suggestions of exposed rocks on the mountain face. Even the areas that are in the full sunlight where the tussock grass is growing, I just added some lighter layer colour, mainly of yellow ochre, burnt sienna, permanent white, and just a dash of ultramarine blue, but really not much ultramarine blue is needed. And then it's just sharpening up some of these shadows. And then the last thing I did was to paint the snow highlights on the tops of the mountains, and this is a mix of permanent white with a little yellow ochre. So the yellow ochre is just going to warm up the white a little bit. But that was it, and the painting here is complete. Now the last thing I did once I'd completed this painting was to peel off the masking tape, and this is always one of my favourite parts of the painting. When it's completed, you can actually get to see what the painting truly looks like without the mess of the paint surrounding the edges. So I really enjoyed painting this artwork. Now just one other thing before you go, if you want to learn about oil painting, then I'm giving away a free ebook called Introduction to Oil Painting on my website, and that's when you subscribe to my email list. So if you subscribe to my email list, I'm giving away this ebook for free. I've also got some painting tutorial videos available on my website as well. I've put the links in the description box below. So I hope you enjoyed this painting and it inspires you to paint with gouache. Thanks for watching. Hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.